Hello and welcome to Take Two, the show that looks at the issues behind the news. I'm Henshall. Today we have some news shorts you may have missed, and I'll be talking to Fran Anderson about the ever worsening news coming from the Fukushima disaster in Japan. And then we have the second part of our interview with John Rees of Stop the War. First, here are the news items. New York Times under attack. US journalist Robert Parry has produced some devastating research into the New York Times and the false stories it prints to promote Washington's wars. Parry dropped out from mainstream journalism years ago, but he still writes with authority and on many issues has maintained his mainstream mindset. So it's all the more surprising to see him going for the jugular and naming the reporter on the New York Times, who he sees as the chief conduit for Washington's war lies. That journalist is the military affairs correspondent Michael Gordon. Gordon had a role in the notorious Iraq weapons of mass destruction hoax, but lead writer Judith Miller got most of the blame. Echoing the BBC's Nick Robinson, who said later, "We are not investigative reporters," Miller excused her laundering of Bush White House lies by saying, "My job isn't to assess the government's information and be an independent intelligence analyst myself. My job is to tell readers of the New York Times what the government thought about Iraq's arsenal." But the problem here was that the government in general never did endorse the lies. It was only the neocon cabal who controlled the White House and, some would say, the New York Times. And if the facts were unverified by their own reporter, why would the New York Times put them on the front page as if they were? Miller was pressured into leaving the New York Times after that, but Gordon has gone on to launder more lies, both on Syria and Ukraine, according to Robert Parry. There is now a pattern to New York Times investigative stories that seek to pin the blame on some nefarious foreign enemy, says Parry. All these stories draw hard conclusions from very murky evidence while ignoring or brushing aside alternative explanations. They also pile up supportive acclamations for their conclusions from usually anonymous Washington sources while dismissing skeptics as fools. Parry cites the three most spectacular Washington lies. The lies about Iraq prior to the illegal invasion, which we just discussed, along with last year's lie that the Assad regime in Syria was firing sarin-laden rockets at the US-backed rebels. In case you missed it, this lie was debunked by Western rocket scientists who calculated the primitive missiles did not have the range needed to come from a Syrian army base. But the latest lie is perhaps the silliest of all. Photographs are supposed to prove that Russian special forces are in eastern Ukraine. Given that NATO's Ukraine coup was most likely carried out by their own special forces, this allegation would hardly be a game changer even if true. But within days, the New York Times went as far as it ever does to retract a story. They ran an obscure article admitting there was doubt. Analysts had checked the sharper pictures on the Times website and they no longer supported the Times allegations. Alternative media investigator Wayne Masden has pointed out the silliest thing of all about this story. The man alleged to be in the Special Forces, identified by the Times, has a long beard, about as conducive to personal survival when you're in the business of killing people as wearing flip-flops. Michael Gordon received special favours from the Pentagon when the hoped-for invasion of Iraq finally took place, by the way. He was the only embedded land-based reporter for the first days of the invasion. And here's the final irony. Gordon later wrote a book described as focusing on the, quote, rushed and haphazard preparations for the Iraq war, unquote. The book was received by enthusiasm by the New York Times. Who else would? Fracking plans in the UK. One beneficiary of NATO's coup in Ukraine is set to be the nascent fracking industry, who argue that with Russia now cast as the enemy, it is important to be self-sufficient in energy. Already, the Condemn coalition here was doing everything it could to promote fracking, perhaps hoping that the new source of wealth for frackers will trickle back into party bank accounts or personal ones. But a wide coalition of interest groups, from traditional conservatives to radical environmental activists, do not want fracking. Predictably, in the mother of democracies, the condemned solution is not to listen to public opinion and install renewable energy systems, but to change the law to make it harder for the public to stop fracking. How might they do this? It seemed like just a rumour at first, but now it's official, and Greenpeace are running a petition on it. The plan is to change the law so that you cannot object if a fracking company wants to drill under your property. Greenpeace already have well over 160,000 signatures on their petition. Unfortunately, however, Greenpeace have also let themselves be used to boost NATO's anti-Russian campaign, so many of the activists will be reluctant to sign up to this particular petition. Ralph Nader calls for political realignment to stop empire. Ralph Nader is the real deal. He came to prominence in the 1960s when General Motors tried to have him murdered for publicising a dangerous fault in one of their cars, and he's been a consumer and political campaigner ever since. In 2000, he was the US Green Party presidential candidate. He was attacked by the Democrats for siphoning off votes and putting Bush in power, but events have shown that the post-9/11 wars and the financial heist were just as much Democrat enterprises as Republican ones. Now Nader is calling for a realignment of politics away from the often false left-right division into anti- or pro-empire. He's written a new book, Unstoppable, the emerging left-right alliance to dismantle the corporate state, and contends that such a left-right alliance is not just the stuff of imagination, but is actually emerging. For instance, a House of Representatives vote in July 2013 came within 12 votes of stopping the NSA collecting bulk phone call data in defiance of both Democrat and Republican leaders. Nader sees the war on drugs and bank regulatory efforts as other areas of left-right cooperation. And of course, for those of us elsewhere in the empire, there is the military aggression and endless criminal wars. Nader is calling for the impeachment of Obama for the bloody and illegal NATO bombing campaign that reduced Libya from the richest country in Africa to a terrorist-plagued failed state. Currently, the big threat is a Hillary Clinton presidency, promoted energetic by the usual media cartel, Nader recognises. Even as Secretary of State, Clinton nearly managed to start another war, manoeuvring a feckless Obama into saying he would bomb Syria if they used chemical weapons against NATO-backed insurgents. It was only when the US military found out that an alleged chemical attack was almost certainly a false flag run by Turkey that war was averted. Interestingly, NATO's book has been publicised by a wide spectrum of media outlets, including Democracy Now! And the Huffington Post, media which are often at the forefront of the divide and rule politics, which too often only benefit the corporate élite. The third anniversary of the nuclear disaster at Fukushima, March the 11th, was marked by a protest in London, attended by fashion designer Catherine Hamnett, who we interviewed on the previous show. Fukushima scored level 7, the highest on the international nuclear event scale. All 48 nuclear reactors in Japan have been shut down due to safety fears, and another 6 are in areas at risk from earthquakes. Japanese now face the risk of deadly cancers and birth defects for generations. So Fran, what is the latest on Fukushima?
Well, Ian, the latest news for Fukushima is that despite official Japanese claims that they have the situation under control, evidence shows that things are getting worse. No one knew where the core reactors went. Huge explosions at the Fukushima spewed out a highly radioactive black substance covering Tokyo and is found in soil, litter and dust and samples up to 45, maybe even 200 kilometres away. Marco Catafent, an American researcher, said the black substance very likely contains concentrated unburnt nuclear fuel. In other words, the nuclear cores are dispersed throughout Japan as a radioactive black dust, a situation which Michael Snyder, a nuclear analyst, said is totally unprecedented. Children are estimated to ingest up to 200 milligrams of soil a day due to hand-to-mouth contact. High radiation levels means children can't play outside. This is killing children. They die of heart conditions, asthma, leukemia, thyroiditis. But the authorities still hide the truth from us, said Katsutaka Idegawa, ex-mayor of the city of Futaba. Authorities are also accused of covering up that there weren't only meltdowns, but melt-throughs, where nuclear fuel melts through storage vessels and straight into the ground.
That's very alarming. What are the Japanese government saying about that?
Well, Ian, Japanese victims complain of receiving very little compensation. A poll in June 2013 showed that 59% of Japanese didn't agree with their government's plans to use nuclear energy. Despite Fukushima, their Prime Minister is pro-nuclear. Many Japanese think the government is covering up the scale of the disaster. Japan's nuclear watchdog has pinpointed another 6 nuclear plant locations as at risk of an earthquake. Then there's the effect on other countries. David Polden from Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND, said water used to cool reactors is still flowing into the Pacific beaches on America's west coast, and it's reporting high radiation levels, much higher than the safe level. Pacific islands are also affected, and Russia found that Japanese car imports were contaminated and had to store them securely.
To what extent should people in the rest of the world, where we don't particularly have earthquakes, should we be very worried about this?
Well, yes, Ian, according to anti-nuclear campaigners, nuclear energy is very risky. Amongst many points, they say nuclear power only produces electricity, so we would still need oil for cars and machinery. Nuclear power is very expensive. It's cost the UK more than £70 billion to clean up Sellafield nuclear reprocessing plant.
Wow.
And in the US, a new nuclear plant was estimated to cost up to $18 billion. And also, water contamination is found near many nuclear sites across the world. Nuclear supporters claim that the new generation of reactors can help the environment by transforming nuclear waste into nuclear fuel. But opponents are saying this is irrelevant, as there's no safe way to store, transport or refine nuclear waste. A Greenpeace report called Fukushima Fallout: Nuclear Business Makes People Pay and Suffer. It found that nuclear regulations across the world allow plant operators to make private profits, whilst any accidents are expected to be paid for by governments, meaning us, the taxpayers.
I noticed that Peter Haslam, for the public advisor for the National Nuclear Industry Association, said we need to do something if we're going to keep the lights on. That's their argument.
The nuclear industry uses powerful lobbying and advertising to try to persuade governments and people that the nuclear option is the best solution. But we don't have to use nuclear energy to keep our lights on. As Shigeo Kobayashi from Japanese Against Nuclear UK says, safer and cleaner energy solutions exist. They're only a matter of political choice. There's solar, wind, wave energy, and they're all clean, renewable, low cost. They have low carbon emissions and are sustainable.
So with the disaster at Fukushima and the benefits of alternative sources, are world governments beginning to ditch nuclear energy? Is this argument catching on?
Well, in Denmark and Germany there certainly are. Responding to Fukushima, Germany announced that all its nuclear plants would close by 2022. And Germany is investing in solar and wind energy, aiming to produce 60% of their energy needs via renewables by 2050. The UK is doing the exact opposite, with plans to build a new generation of nuclear power stations. A new privately owned reactor is to be built at Hinkley Point, Somerset in the UK, aiming to provide just 7% of the UK's electricity. And the Stop Hinkley campaign says despite the cuts to public services under austerity measures, the government is willing to loan £17.6 billion to the plant owner's EDF. Consumers will end up paying the price in higher electricity prices. MPs, businessmen and academics have signed a letter to the European Commission asking them to refuse permission for UK state funding for the Hinkley reactor. and under the UK Civil Contingency Act 2004, a risk assessment and plans for emergencies are required before granting planning permission. Hinkley Point potentially puts the population of Bristol, UK at risk, and the Irish National Trust are bringing a legal case against Hinkley Point, which will be heard this summer. The UN says failure to consult neighbouring countries, such as Ireland, is a breach of international law. Solicitor Andrew Jackson said this case is about the public's right to participate in decisions which could affect their lives.
Well, thanks very much, Fran. Well, now I'm pleased to welcome John Rees from the UK's Stop the War, which is the UK's leading anti-war organisation. John Rees is a national officer. Well, now, John, I'd like to ask you about, what's on everybody's mind at the moment, Ukraine. Now, first of all, I remember CND many years ago when I was involved with them. They used to have extremely good channels of information into the British establishment, very discreetly. They knew the exact date when the first Gulf War was launched 6 months before. Do you have any inside tips on what's going on in Ukraine?
No, I'm afraid I don't. But I think there's a reason for that, and it's to do with the contrast between those two wars. You see, the Gulf War, especially the first Gulf War, was a war where the entirety of the major powers in the UN Security Council all decided that they were going to participate, or at least allowed the Americans to lead an attack on Iraq. And that was an enormously long build-up. There was a 6 month period of military build-up. So you could see that coming. What we're seeing in the conflict in the Ukraine is something which has departed from the whole pattern of conflicts over the war on terror. And that pattern was one in which, like the first Gulf War, the major powers, willingly or unwillingly in some cases, more or less allowed the United States to attack much, much weaker, much, much smaller states in the system. What's emerging here is a conflict between two major powers, between Russia on the one hand and the American-led NATO alliance on the other. And there's a great deal more at stake, even than there have been in some of the recent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's a much more dangerous situation. They're both nuclear armed alliances. And so I think the fragility of the situation, the degree to which even the participants don't really know where it's going to lead, the fact that this is being conducted in the first instance by a proxy regime for the West in Kiev and by forces resistant to it, which certainly, although the propaganda says they're all directly under Moscow's control, I don't think we have to believe that. They may in some general sense look to Russia rather than to the West, but they're not tools of the Russian regime. So there are a lot more uncertainties in this equation than there were in the Gulf War.
There seems to be a big gulf, particularly big gulf over Ukraine. On the one hand, the people who read the mainstream media here, a lot of them still think, I think they still think that it was a genuine popular revolution in Kiev, whereas anybody who is informed from outside the mainstream, particularly Russia Today, which is increasingly influential here in the UK as a news channel, they're seeing the Kiev regime as a completely illegitimate, sort of almost fascist in some respects regime. I mean, how do you cope with this at Stop the War? Because you must have supporters from both camps. It must be very difficult to keep everybody happy.
Well, as far as Stop the War is concerned, we don't necessarily have to agree on an exact analysis of the internal dynamic in the Ukraine. What we have to agree on is whether we agree with or are going to oppose the actions of our own government. We're citizens of this country. In the first instance, it's what our government matters, which is the target for our campaigning. And our government has been complicit in this process over a long period of time. The massive eastward expansion of NATO after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the similar expansion of the EU, its constant interference in the affairs of Ukraine. This summer there will be a joint military exercise including UK and US troops on Ukrainian soil. It will be the 11th such exercise dating back to 1997. And so our business is to make people aware of this context and what our government has done to worsen, and is still doing to worsen, the crisis in Ukraine. As to what actually happened on the ground, I don't think, personally, I'm speaking personally now, I don't think you have to take either of those two positions. You can view it as a protest which started for the same reasons that most people will go onto the streets in most places. They don't like economic austerity. They don't like what's happening with the government, which wasn't a particularly pleasant government in the first place. But the people who go on the streets and start a movement like that aren't necessarily the people who end up being in power. In fact, quite frequently, they aren't the same people.
Yeah.
And so I don't
As we
think...
saw in Egypt.
Yes, yeah, indeed. And Egypt's a very good example. You know, there was a mass movement which was fed up with the Morsi government, often for good reasons. It came out in its millions on the 30th of June, but by the 3rd of July, and things happen very quickly when there's mass movements developing like this, a completely different set of people, the military, has seized power. In fact, this is what happens in revolutions. You know, the people who picked the power up in Ukraine are a particularly unpleasant group of people. They're oligarchs, incredibly rich people, and the major internal ministries, defence and the interior ministry, are in the hands of fascists who would make Western European fascists look like a wing of the Liberal Party.
Yeah, and that raises the question of whether they always do support this sort of fascist thing if they feel it's necessary for their greater goals, and the answer seems to be yes, they do.
Well, I think certainly the neoconservative trend in the United States has always taken the view that if it could get regime change by backing a popular rebellion against a regime that they didn't like, then that was fine with it. It would work very hard to make sure that people it could do business with emerged as the leadership of that. I think that sometimes makes people unduly cynical about any mass movement, but I think that's wrong. Well, what it should point us to is that you have to fight to get a leadership of a mass movement which represents the people who are doing the fighting and not allow it to be hijacked. That's the lesson it should give us.
Democratisation. There must be popular control.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And one of the great weaknesses. I mean, I was a participant in the Egyptian revolution. I was in Tahrir Square for 9 out of the 18 days that overthrew Mubarak. And one of the things that you very quickly notice is that, unlike most revolutions, there was no institutional frame for popular power. You know, there was no popular committees, there was no workers' councils. You know, there was no equivalent even of the Long Parliament in the English Revolution of the 17th century. And in the end, if you don't institutionalise power and have your own representatives, somebody else will represent you.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned NATO. I mean, NATO crops up again and again all over the world. Would you like to see it collapse? NATO collapse,
yes,
be dissolved?
I think it's a relic of the Cold War. It's, as you say, it's the pact against which it was opposed was dismantled long ago. The eastward expansion of it is an outrageous act of expansion, really, especially when it's now a matter of the public record that the then Secretary of State in the United States, James Baker, told Mikhail Gorbachev at the time that Russian troops were withdrawn from Germany, and I quote, that NATO would not move 1 inch east. Now, there are many thousands of miles east now.
Yeah.
Hungary, the Czech Republic, that was part of the background to the Balkan War. And now the Baltic states on the border of Russia. There's been a policy of surrounding the Russian state with American bases and NATO allies, and this is part of the obviously of the issue in the Ukraine.
Do you see this as just a sort of institutional thing, that there's just a lot of bureaucrats getting well paid who are desperate not to lose their jobs, or do you see it as a bit more sinister sort of?
No, I think there's a bigger thing than that, and that is that it's long been part of American strategic thinking to dominate what the CIA and the Pentagon call the Eurasian landmass, which is everything from the coast, the west coast of Ireland, through to the far
Vladivostok.
Yes, exactly. And they've always had the view that they had to have allies in the West that would share the burden, that would be the first on the battlefield, that what they'd learnt from 2 world wars is that America didn't have the reach to do that, although it then, in their view, always found themselves fighting in those wars. So it's a long-held strategic operation to have something like the NATO alliance functioning in Western Europe, and an endless debate about the fact that the West Europeans should be paying more for this rather than the Americans. And
that's how they get the West Europeans on board with their... Because, of course, the thing about Ukraine is it's wholly against the interests of Europe, as I read it.
Well, I'm not sure about that. You see, I mean, the EU is a capitalist club, and they've always got an interest in more markets of sources of raw material or sources of cheap labour, and so expansion suits the EU economically in a way that military bases and expansion in NATO suits the American strategy. So I think they're pretty much 2 sides of the same coin. There are, of course, the economic connections that you talk about, but it's been a long-held theory, but never an accurate one, that economic ties will prevent conflict. Really what happens is that when the conflict comes, the economic ties break, and sometimes the attempt to construct economic linkages produces war in the first place. So I don't necessarily see those. I see it as a break on the process, but a break that at some point will be lifted. And a couple of weeks ago, the Russians and the Chinese decided to start trading oil in currencies other than the dollar, and that's one sign that some of those linkages are beginning to break down.
Right. Thanks very much. Well, that brings to an end this episode of Take Two. Thank you for watching. Thank you to the People's Voice for screening us. Thank you to Coffee Plant for sponsoring us. And if you wish to see any of our previous shows, just go to YouTube, our YouTube channel, RADTV UK.